Tim Sandefur. Tim the lawyer. How you doing, Tim?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm awesome. I was just listening to that Clips of the Week, and it's just, God, it's so different than any other cycle. It's just, we're into, as many people have said over and over again, we're just into uncharted territory with all this stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's. I was a little bothered by it last week. Joe said that he tried not to get worked up about elections anymore because he found that it made him physically ill, and now he's out sick today.
So let me start here. And you're by the way, Tim Sandefur, Vice President for Litigation for the Goldwater Institute. That's a heck of a title there. So congratulations.
It's almost too long to fit on the business card.
But I want to talk to you. It's just Tim the lawyer, a fan of constitutional and American founding history. How does a democracy end up coughing up the two major candidates? And we'll get into Gary Johnson and everything else. I know you hate it when people just focus on the big two. But how does a democracy cough up the two major candidates that have an approval rating of 37%? How does that happen?
Oh, well, actually, there's two answers to that. The first one is what's remarkable is the fact that the American democracy is unique in that it has rarely tossed up characters like this.
So this usually happens?
Yeah, well, a pure democracy, true majority rules unlimited, that was the situation, say, for example, in ancient Greece. And as a result, you had a lot of demagogues and dangerous leaders who would come up, a lot of turbulence in the political society, and ultimately it destroyed itself. And so when the Founding Fathers were writing the Constitution, their goal was to limit democracy and restrict those dangerous tendencies of pure democracy with a constitutional system. And so what we're seeing, I think, in large part, is the consequences of the breakdown of those constitutional limits on democracy. And so we're starting to see the problems that arise when you have pure majority rule.
So you think there's too much democracy going on?
That's exactly right. And secondly, what you have is this gets a little technical. There's something called the arrow impossibility theorem, which is a political theory that shows that you cannot have a majority vote that actually represents what the majority of the people truly want.
Explain that.
And well, the way the theorem works is that how you hold a majority vote affects the outcome. So the fact that you have primaries and then a general election, the fact that some states get to vote before other states and everything, those things affect the outcome in ways so that the ultimate result is not what the majority of people wanted. And this is a theory we come up with actually about 200 years ago, but given most popularity by an economist named Kenneth Arrow. And just Google up the Arrow impossibility theorem for a technical explanation. But it shows that you can't actually have the true will of the people represented in an election system like we have. And that's why, again, the Constitution was written so that the will of the people was not the only thing that we were pursuing. We were also trying to protect justice and individual rights and things like that. And because the Constitution is now not given the respect that it ought to be given, that's why we're in such a difficult situation today.
The reason we have you on the show is so you bring up various theorems. I mean, because I hardly ever throw around.
Every day I get to use the terms impossibility theorem. But
So George Will, who has mentioned you glowingly in his columns in the Washington Post in the past, he is super anti-Trump, as you know, and hopes he's working to have Trump lose all 50 states. But he said the other day in his column, and I'm paraphrasing, the one good thing that could come out of a Trump presidency is that maybe we would abandon forever this idea that the president is sort of our moral authority of everything in chief, that it's kind of grown into.
Yeah, it was a great point, and I certainly hope that's true.
What was, and I've been reading about this just recently on some books that you recommended to me, what were the Founding Fathers intending the presidency to be versus what it is now?
The president, he has basically two roles, foreign and domestic. And when it comes to foreign policy, the president is supposed to be, he's the commander-in-chief of the military. He's in charge of the diplomatic forces of the government. He's supposed to be the primary representative when it comes to the foreign parts, the foreign relations issues that the federal government deals with. Domestically, though, he's much more limited. And the Founding Fathers were very worried about the power of the president, and they tried to restrict his powers greatly because they didn't want to have a single person who controlled the political situation within the United States. That power is supposed to be at the state level. It's supposed to be state governors, state legislatures, and state courts that take the primary role in regulating domestic life in the United States, which is one reason why the Goldwater Institute has put so much emphasis on the role of state constitutions and state laws. What I think our primary hope in this rather dark and depressing election cycle, our primary hope is that whoever is elected president, we can still defend our rights at the state level by taking action to protect individual freedom with state constitutions through state courts and through state legislatures.
Well, there's the actual power legal, at least so far, until the Supreme Court steps in, I guess, and says some of these executive orders don't work. But they're the actual legal things that presidents are doing now that they didn't do in past years. But what about just the way the president is looked at in society? Do you think the Founding Fathers would be surprised at the way we view the presidency?
Well, I don't think they'd be surprised. I think they'd be disappointed, especially Jefferson and his admirers. I mean, of course, the first president was unanimously elected. Everybody knew that George Washington was going to be president. The man could very well have made himself the king if he wanted to.
And
incredibly powerful.
And clearly for the first president, we needed to bring everybody together. We needed the sort of person that we kind of all worshipped as one and looked to for guidance. I can see why that, but since Washington, we didn't want that. We don't want that, do we?
That's right, and there's a wonderful moment at the Constitutional Convention where they're saying they're talking about the powers of the president, and George Washington gets up and leaves the room so that they could discuss what the president ought to do, because everybody knew it would be George, and he didn't want to embarrass everybody by sitting there and listening to them talk. And what the founders said was, we're not always going to have a Washington. They said, let's design a constitution and imagine that the worst possible person is president of the United States. Now, how would you want the Constitution to be designed?
That's a good way to look at it.
And that's why the system is designed to limit the powers of president, Congress, and courts in order to protect us against bad people who might be running those offices.
I was reading from Ronald.
But to get to the question you were asking, though, they certainly did not expect the president of the United States to be the emotional and psychological counselor for the United States, to tuck Americans into bed at night and to read them a bedtime story and to wake them up in the morning and tell them to put their shoes on and get to work. Today, we do look at the president as the leader of the people, and that was precisely the opposite of what the Founding Fathers wanted. When Andrew Jackson ran for president, who was almost as terrible as today's candidates are, when Jackson ran for president, Jefferson said that no person could be less qualified for the presidency of the United States, and he was really concerned about what Jackson's presidency meant for the country. And this is just why, because he was afraid that these popular leaders who really aren't qualified for office, and yet they inspire this irrational enthusiasm in large crowds, they were really worried about what that would do to the country.
Andrew Jackson, the first populist?
Definitely, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Populism is interesting. I want to talk more with Tim Sandefur, Tim the lawyer we call him, Vice President for Litigation for the Goldwater Institute coming up. Tim's going to stay with us. I got more questions, and Tim's pretty out and proud anti-Trump on his Twitter feed. We'll see how far he wants to go on the air with that. But what are you actually worried about? Well, we'll talk about some of that and the presidency, and just we're talking with Tim Sandefur, Vice President for Litigation for the Goldwater Institute. We call him Tim the lawyer and have for many, many years. Tim, thanks for sticking around with us this morning.
Thanks, and you know everybody can follow me by going to timthelawyer.com as well.
Yeah, and certainly your Twitter feed has been pretty anti-Trump, I've noticed.
Yeah,
not a big Trump fan.
I do. I have my personal views about the election, like everybody else does,
sure.
and I think that both candidates of the major parties are serious threats to the future of our constitutional system. And it's depressing to look at the election situation, which is why I think that now more than ever we need to return to our national belief in the Constitution and the protections that our founding fathers created for us, particularly, as I said, the protections at the state level. You know, the American Revolutionary generation lived through tyranny. They experienced what an absolute or wanted to be absolute monarch was really like, and they created a system to prevent that from ever happening again. And so we have the tools at our disposal to protect ourselves if we're willing.
Well, I read Reagan's inaugural address, his convention speech from 1980 the other day. I think I came across it on your Twitter feed. And he quoted Abraham Lincoln, that our system is set up that nobody could do that much tremendous harm to this country in a 4-year term. So do you believe that?
I do think that, but I also think that Lincoln, probably Lincoln's first famous speech when he was still a rather young guy was a speech called the Lyceum Address, and it's worth it for all our listeners to stop and read that speech today, because in it was like 30 years before the Civil War. Lincoln warns that he says, America will never be invaded or conquered by a foreign foe. Our danger is death from suicide, and the way that a democracy commits suicide is by looking around for some savior to protect the people who actually gets into power and then takes over for himself. And this was something, of course, the Founding Fathers well knew. Here's a line from the first Federalist paper, Federalist paper number 1. A dangerous ambition often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people. Those men who have overturned the liberties of republics have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. And Lincoln warns about this in his speech, in the Lyceum speech. He says, we will never be conquered by an outside foe, but if we stop respecting the law and we revert to mob rule instead, then it won't be long before we are ruled by a Caesar or a dictator.
Well, there's no doubt that that's happened throughout history, that very scenario. I mean, if you study history at all, you've seen it happen all over. I just don't think Trump has the interest in it. I just think he's too lazy for it. I think he'd like to be president for a variety of ego reasons, but I just don't think he has the energy or the desire.
That may be true, but the problem is that people who like that, once they get into power, surround themselves with henchmen who are very eager to use power in the name of the lazy ruler. So you have a king who doesn't pay much attention, but it's his ministers who go around oppressing the people and saying that they're doing it in the king's name. And the king, he doesn't care, so he's like, whatever, and that's the real danger in such a situation.
Interesting point. It is a bit of a tiring game because there's no definitive answer of the what would the Founding Fathers think of this today game, but I was thinking about it the other night.
No. In this case, there is a definitive answer. Every single one of the founding fathers would vomit his guts out.
About Trump in particular, or just the election overall?
I think about both.
Vomit his guts out. But I'm reading a couple of different books that you recommended to me when I said I wanted to read about the Bill of Rights and Constitution and everything like that. And I'm just reading through their various arguments and constitutional convention, stuff like that. And when I was watching the convention, I think this week, the Democrats' convention, but there was some of it in the Republican convention too. I think one of the things that would strike the founding fathers, I think, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, is when did we become in charge of all this? I mean, all these conversations about making people's lives better in all these different ways that are never discussed in the constitutional conventions, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking on the way in, the only time in this entire election cycle that I have felt proud to be an American was the speech given by Khizr Khan, the father of the killed soldier who challenged Donald Trump and asked him if he had ever read the Constitution of the United States. What a stirring moment that speech was. And it's a question that just absolutely equally could be aimed at Hillary Clinton. The idea that the government is in charge of making our lives better and giving us meaning and coddling us and telling us that we can earn $10 an hour instead of $5 an hour and all this sort of nonsense, none of that is the responsibility of the government. The government is there to protect individual rights and leave us the hell alone.
And then things turn out the way they're going to turn out.
That's right. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, says that the only thing necessary to make us a happy people is a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another and leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits.
So how long did it stay that way? I know we've talked about this before. Did it have a good run clear up to the early 20th century when you get into the progressives? Is that when it all changed?
I don't think there is any one moment when it all changed. I think there have been a lot of, obviously, that promise of liberty was never given to slaves, and to women were denied their freedom for a great deal of time. So there's no golden age or any one moment where it all went wrong. But the current crisis we're suffering mostly traces itself back to the beginning of the progressive era, which would have been about 1900 or so, when leading intellectuals abandoned the idea on which the Constitution is based and said, no, rights are just privileges that are given to you by the government, and we should have more democracy and let the majority decide and get rid of all these checks and balances and create these administrative agencies that aren't even elected, where these bureaucrats who aren't responsible to the people are making decisions for how we live our lives. That's really the basic source of our problems today.
But I'm standing by this, that if you had the founding fathers sitting out in the crowd for any of these conventions, the thing that would be most amazing to them, once you get past there are black people here, there's a woman on stage. Once you get past all that, they would just be checking off in their head. They're talking about schools. What's the president got to do with that? They're talking about wages. What the hell's the president got to do with that? They're talking about who loves who and who's marrying who. What's the hell the president got to do with that? I think they would just constantly be thinking, why is the president talking about this?
I think they would point at both Trump and Clinton, and then they would turn to us and they would say, I told you so. The Founding Fathers warned us that these would be the consequences if we ignored our constitutional system and started looking to the government to solve all of our problems and stopped relying on our own initiative, on free markets, on strong private property rights, on limited government. That the Founding Fathers warned us that if we didn't work to preserve our freedom, it would deteriorate and it would ultimately collapse. And I worry that is the precipice that we're on.
Well, with Hillary and Trump both at 37%, and I assume those numbers are going to go lower by the time we get through this next 102 days as they kill each other. Somebody's going to go into office with like a 20% approval rating. It's going to be just ugly as hell. So clearly this isn't the end of something. This has got to be the beginning of something.
I definitely hope so. And you're right. The person will be elected with some 20% number and then claim that he has a mandate for change. And then it will be up to us, the people, to return to the principles of our Constitution and to protect our freedoms, mostly at the state level, by passing laws to, for example, eminent domain. After the horrible Supreme Court decision in Kelo versus New London, which Donald Trump has openly endorsed and said he thought was a good decision, the Supreme Court said it was okay for the government to use eminent domain to steal your property and give it to a private developer for his own private use. Well, it still is available to the states to pass laws to prohibit that from happening because most eminent domain takes place at the state level. So we at the Goldwater Institute have developed an initiative called the Property Ownership Fairness Act, and we're asking states to pass this law to protect private property owners and restrict the government's power to steal your property and give it to somebody else. It's initiatives like that that are going to protect our freedom against government overreaching, including federal overreaching, if we are willing to do it.
Yeah, I think if anything out of this cycle, and especially if Trump's elected, there's going to be a resurgence of the power of the courts and the legislature and maybe the states that might be welcome. So. And
that's one of the benefits of the two-party system is that, and Founding Fathers understood this, they called this checks and balances, is that if you divide up these groups like this, they will watch each other. And they will, and that's why you were saying that, isn't it funny that the Democrats are now wrapping themselves in flags and speaking in tones that are typically Republican tones? That happens all the time, and it's supposed to work that way. Because with both parties pointing fingers at each other and ready to pounce on each other, that protects those of us who just want to live our lives in freedom. So we need more checks and balances like that.
Good stuff. How about, to end with, I'll give you 30 seconds on why it's not a waste of your vote to vote for Gary Johnson, the Libertarian.
It's never a waste of your vote to vote for what you actually believe. It is a waste of your vote to vote for somebody for whom you have contempt simply because you think that's the strategic way to do it. And I think that a vote for Johnson, if it is likely to turn the vote against a dishonorable, dishonest person who has no familiarity at all with the Constitution or the legal system or the economic system of this country, I don't see that as being a loss for us.
There you go, Tim Sandefur, Vice President for Litigation for the Goldwater Institute. Thanks for your time today, Tim.
Thank you.
Good conversation as always with Tim. What an interesting guy to talk to.